Alright, so we are back. Welcome to Module 2. Today we're going to be talking about routine services, the stuff you're going to see the most, day-to-day work, repairs, and how to do a quick vehicle inspection. I'm going to emphasize the word quick there. So let's get going. Okay, a couple things we're going to be talking about: jump starting a car, quick inspections, oil changes, tire rotations, transmission services, differential services, tune-ups, brakes, finally belt replacements. Those are just some of the common things you're going to see. First of all, a lot of you guys might know this, but some of you might not. How to jump start a vehicle properly. So just a good thing to go over real quick. It's pretty simple to do, and all you really need to know: red to red, black to black. Be careful not to touch the cable ends together, spark them, or allow them to touch a metal surface while attached to the battery. Example: if you have the red cable attached, the red jumper cable attached to the battery, and you touch the black one to a ground, you're going to start sparking. Just something to watch out for. Here's a tech tip, something you might not know. For diesel vehicles, you are not supposed to jump start a diesel, and the reason for that is the glow plug control relay or module can get seized or get stuck. You can actually get the glow plug relay stuck. The glow plugs are going to turn on and stay on until they melt themselves apart, and worst case scenario, your glow plug actually melts and falls into the cylinder, falls on top of the piston. So really bad. There is a way to do it. The proper way to do it is to jump start a diesel is just to let it idle. If you need to jump start a diesel, let it idle with jumper cables attached to another vehicle, for a half hour or so to charge the battery, then disconnect it and try to start it. That's the safest way to do it, so you will never have any problems. Quick vehicle inspections. Now this is really important. This is one thing I want you to take away from this class. A vehicle inspection is a pretty common practice for repair shops. Before any routine or service or any repair, the vehicle should go through an inspection. Now, a lot of shops are going to have different ways to do this, different lists to go through, but this is an area where a lot of techs we see get bogged down. They waste a lot of precious time on vehicle inspections. I've seen guys spend 45 minutes just inspecting a vehicle, listing everything they find, and this is what, it's an important step, but this is something that we really want to save time on. Different shops use different inspections. There's 20-point inspections, 45-point inspections. You may even see 100-point inspection. No matter what system your shop uses, you can use the same method to get this vehicle inspection done, and we can get this vehicle inspection to where you can be able to get it all the way done in 10 minutes or less. So I also have a download at the link below to see what inspection sheet I use. I'm going to give you an example of the ones I use at my shop, and that'll help you out. And this too, if your shop has their own inspection sheet, you can use this and fill theirs in later. I don't think it really matters, but basically, quick inspections. Vehicle inspections are a very good way to generate more work. Without those inspections, we're losing a lot of work. Example: your vehicle comes in for an oil change. You give it a quick inspection. You find some loose suspension parts. You find it needs a tune-up. Anyways, this is also so a lot of shops, really emphasize the inspection to sell more work. But another part of that is this is also a duty you should be providing to your customers. It is your duty to, when you have the vehicle in the air, to look it over. Put yourself in the customer's shoes. If you had your vehicle in for brakes and you had Something like your exhaust was literally hours or minutes away from falling apart. They go down the road, and 2 days later, the exhaust falls apart. They're like, why didn't you guys let me know about this? It was about to break apart, or you name it. Or notice a pretty big leak. It's your duty to tell the customers of what you're finding. So let's go on to let's move on to routine services. Routine services, what this is, basically the jobs you can expect to see the most often. We're going to teach you how to do them properly and quickly and save a lot of time. So here's a couple of the things you can expect to see on a weekly basis, maybe even daily basis. Oil changes, transmission services, differential services, tune-ups, brakes, belts. Some real common ones for you there. So we're going to just kind of walk through the best, quickest, and proper way to do these. So let's start out with oil changes. Oil changes, by far the most common service. You're going to get, especially entry-level tech, you're going to get bombarded with these oil changes. You just need to be able to bang your way through them and move on to the more important work. But oil, just so we're all on the same page here, different techs have different theories about oil, but this is what I always tell my customers. Your oil should be changed every 3,000 miles when you use conventional. Synthetics, I recommend 5,000 miles on synthetic oil changes. Some manufacturers, and this is a little frustrating, some manufacturers, even in their owner's manual, will advise up to 7,000 miles between oil changes. In some, they even state in the owner's manual that an oil filter only need be changed every other oil change, which is ridiculous. I don't know anybody that does that, and I really don't know why manufacturers say that or recommend that, but everybody who changes the oil always changes the filter. I would never do that on my own vehicles, change a filter between oil changes, but anyway. So just advise your customers, this is what I would do, and people learn to really appreciate that if you say this is what I would do if it were my vehicle. So besides just changing the oil, there's a few things you should also do. Set tire pressure, check and top off fluids, grease the fittings if applicable. A lot of the newer vehicles don't have grease fittings, which is kind of nice for us, but always good to check. And of course, your quick inspection. And I have a video for you guys to watch, just going over the proper way to do an oil change and talking about the quick inspection, going into a little bit more detail with that. So you can click the link below, check out the video. Alright, hope you watched that video. Moving on here, tire rotations. Something that usually I inspect the vehicle. If the tires are starting to chop or wear funny, I recommend rotation. When we talk about a rotation, always rotate the tires front to back and back to front, unless otherwise requested by the customer. There's really no need to go, rotate in a diagonal fashion. The most important thing is to get the front wheels on the back, because the front wheels are always going to wear they're always going to wear faster than the rear, typically, because they do all the steering, changes the caster, changes the camber as you turn your steering wheel. So first step to a tire rotation, you're going to grab your 1/2-inch gun. You're going to remove all the lug nuts, just zip them right off. You don't have to be careful about ruining that threads or anything like that. Zip them right off. Move the tires to their new location. And if tires are seized on, if the tires are not going to come off nicely, grab a dead blow hammer, smack the back of the tire. Make sure you don't touch the rim, because you can bend, especially aluminum rims. So go ahead and smack it right on the, the rubber of the sidewall of the tire, and a lot of times it'll pop them off. You can take a lug nut and just start the lug nut with a couple threads while you're popping it off so it doesn't fly at you. Once you have the tires in the correct location, again, go ahead with your lug nuts. Start them by hand. Always start them by hand. Very important that you don't use an air tool to start them, because you'll definitely cross thread them no matter how good you are. So go around by hand. Start every lug nut, just a couple threads. And a little tech tip here is use torque sticks. So we need to tighten the lug nuts. Two ways to do that. You can take a torque wrench and individually torque every single lug nut, or you can save a whole lot of time and grab what's called a torque stick. You can see the picture I have here for you. The torque sticks work by changing the width or the diameter of the shaft of the torque stick. So a smaller diameter torque stick is going to be a smaller torque. I think my kit has 80, 100, 120, 140. So the two most common ones are 100 and 120. Basically, smaller passenger cars are going to get 100. Pickups, SUVs, they're going to get 120. If you're unsure, you'll really get in a habit of what takes what. But if you're unsure, look up your torque. But anyways, yeah, these torque sticks. You grab the 100 foot-pound torque stick. You're going to want to put your impact on the number 3 setting, so your highest setting, and the torque stick's actually going to limit how much torque goes through that shaft to the socket. So just zip them on, of course, in a crisscross pattern. Go ahead and zip them on, let your impact go basically until it stops turning the socket, and you can see it slow down, stop turning, go around, tighten them all up. Really easy. It's a lot more complicated than it sounding than it really is. So finally, always with a tire rotation, set and check air tire pressure. You'd be pretty upset if somebody rotated your tires and didn't set your tire pressure, so just make sure to do that. Okay, transmission services. A lot of people also have different recommendations when it comes to transmission services. What I recommend to my customers, you can drive your factory transmission fluid to 100,000 miles, and every 50,000 miles after that have it serviced. If you're doing a lot of towing or plowing, then you're going to want to do it more often. But if you're not doing those two things, really, this is sufficient. Again, you tell people, if you're the guy who tells people you should get your transmission serviced every 20,000 miles, some people are going to think that you're just out for money. So, first thing to do before a transmission service, this is really important. We want to see how the trans is operating before we service it. Reason being, here's a common myth. My transmission's acting up. Must be time for a transmission service. So customer comes in, a lot of times I won't even mention it. They'll say, yep, I'd like my transmission to be serviced. Okay. You'd be surprised when I've started getting in the habit before we're doing any transmission services, to ask the customer, are you experiencing any problems? And you'd be surprised at how many people actually say, well, yes. I'm getting a really long delay into reverse, or feels like my transmission might be starting to slip between a couple gears. So you always want to be upfront about that with them, because guess what? If you do a transmission service and a week later the transmission completely goes out, they're going to come looking at you and say, well, it wasn't like this before. You must have screwed something up. So you always want to make sure, even if they say the transmission's working great, test drive it. Test drive it before. You want to feel the gears. You want to make sure you have all the gears it's supposed to have, 4 gears, 5 gears. Feel the torque converter clutch lock up, that type of thing. Make sure you don't have any abnormalities, is what I was trying to say, before you do the trans service. So that way, when you're done with the transmission service, you knew the trans worked before. So if there is a problem, you can attest to that and say, yeah, that trans did have 4 gears before, and so on and so forth. Okay. When it comes to transmission services, there is one symptom I had on there. 95% of the time, a trans service will not cure any transmission issues. So a lot of people that's their go-to if they're having transmission problems, to go ahead and start with the service. Most of the time, it's a big waste of time. The one time that a transmission service can cure an issue is when you're experiencing a shudder. And a shudder is like a feeling like you're almost going over a rumble strip on the side of the road. When your clutches are actually slipping into the next gear, or engaging, there's supposed to be a nice smooth engagement. Sometime with fluid that's really thinned out, really poor condition, it can feel like a shudder where it grabs and releases really fast. So now that we have that behind us, to go ahead and perform the transmission service, first step, get it up in the air, drop the transmission pan if there is one, pull the drain plug if there's not one, drop the transmission pan, inspect for debris. If there's a bunch of clutch or a bunch of metal in the transmission pan, obviously that's a problem. You might not even need to go any further. Remove the transmission filter. Usually they pull right out of the bottom. Sometimes there's a bolt or two holding them in place. So replace the filter, replace it with new. Always make sure there's an O-ring or some type of a seal where your transmission fits into the pump or fits into the transmission. Sometimes the seal pops out, stays with the filter. You put the new filter in, not paying attention, no seal, you got problems. So just pay attention to that. Once your filter's installed, go ahead and clean your transmission pan. Wipe it with a rag, use a little brake clean, whatever you like to do there is fine. Wipe the gasket sealing surface clean. Always replace the gasket unless it's a reusable gasket. A reusable gasket is going to be a metal gasket molded in rubber. So you'll get an idea once you see a few of these what a reusable gasket is. If you are installing a new gasket, always install the gasket dry. Some guys we see like to coat them in silicone. You really don't want to do that. Just do a dry gasket. Let's see. Tech tip here. Never use rubber gaskets. They are absolute junk. Rubber transmission gaskets. A few of the auto parts stores will sell a transmission filter kit. Comes with a gasket. Some of them come with a rubber gasket. You'll have nothing but problems with these guys. You'll put them on. If they're not going to leak immediately, they will leak shortly thereafter. So, cork is another type of transmission gasket. They're okay. They work pretty good. Fiber is almost like a cardboard type material. Those work the best. I've always had the best luck with those. Some transmission pans use silicone. So if you had basically whatever you had to take coming apart. If you had silicone coming apart, you're going to want to re-silicone it. If you had a gasket coming apart, you're probably going to want to gasket it. Another tech tip. If your pan uses silicone, you can quickly remove the silicone by using a wire wheel on a bench grinder. Kind of a cool trick. You grab your pan. I like to take a little scraper tool with a razor blade, scrape off the excess amount of silicone. You're always going to have some left on there. You can either sit there for 5 minutes scraping it with a razor blade, or grab your pan, march over to your bench grinder, which is usually going to have a grinder on one side and a wire wheel on the other side. That's how all mine always are. And always wear your safety glasses when doing this, but go ahead and just buzz the pan right on that wire wheel. It just zips off that silicone real nice. Reseal using oil resistant silicone. I talked more about that in the making the repair section, and that's going to do it for that. So now you got your pan installed, you got your filter installed. Torque your pan bolts to spec. You can look it up, or again, guys, you're going to get an idea for what bolts require what spec. If you got real tiny bolts, you might want to put them to 100. If they're a little bit larger bolts, I like to put them to 125 inch-pounds, of course, not foot-pounds. We'll snap any bolt of that diameter with foot-pounds. So now that you got your pan installed, next, find your transmission cooler lines. There's going to be 2 lines, a feed and a return. Attempt to locate the return line from the transmission. I have a chart that I hang on my wall. It's a cooler line return chart. Another way to do it, if you really need to do it, is grab both lines as it's running. The hottest line is going to be the feed. The cooler line is going to be the return. Makes sense because the fluid comes out hot, it goes through the coolers, and then it comes back to the transmission. So you want to locate the return line and disconnect it. And I always like to disconnect it and put the return line in a bucket before it goes into, so you're basically separating the return line somewhere before it goes back into the transmission. So put 5 or 6 quarts of clean fluid in the transmission. Have a helper start the vehicle for you, and you're going to sit there underneath the vehicle watching the fluid as it drains into the bucket. You're going to keep an eye on it, and as soon as that fluid starts turning into a bright red color, have them shut it off. Reattach the cooler lines. You're now ready to top off the trans to the correct level, usually another 5 or 6 quarts, and that is it. You are then ready to check your transmission fluid. Every transmission, every automatic transmission, the fluid needs to be, I should say, one exception that I know of, some Honda transmissions you can check and park, but for the most part, just get in the habit of checking every transmission while it's running. Park or neutral, check the transmission fluid level. Most dipsticks, there's a cold and a hot mark. Here's another tech tip for you. I prefer to fill the transmissions, overfill the transmissions just a bit. What I like to do is, while the transmission's actually cold, I like to put it right to the hot mark. Exception, Allison transmissions. We don't want to overfill Allison transmissions because they have a tendency to run hotter than they normally would. But the reason I do that is 2 things. Big myth is that a transmission is going to be damaged by overfull fluid. That's incorrect. Basically, the only negative thing that could come from a fluid being too full is it could come out the vent of the transmission. If it gets hot, if it gets really hot, fluid expands while it gets hot. It could spill out the vent, which isn't great because it makes a mess, and it could get on the exhaust, on a super hot exhaust, potentially create a flame, which we don't want to do. So you don't want to go nuts, but the advantage to this is you fill it to the full mark, and your customer later on develops a transmission leak, a small leak. It's going to give them a lot more time to notice that leak before it's too late, because bad things happen to transmissions when they run low on fluid. So anyway, that's just kind of a habit I've gotten into, and for the most part, it's going to help out. Some transmissions you'll find have no dipsticks. Instead, they're going to use check plugs. So you can always use your service information to, your service manuals to check. Sometimes they're obvious, sometimes they're not, to check how the correct way to check a transmission fluid is if you're not sure. Okay, moving on to a differential service, diff service. Diff services are recommended at different intervals based on manufacturer. Rule of thumb that I like to throw out there is 100,000 miles. Get your diff service replaced at every 100,000 miles. So diff fluids usually last a long time. Some differentials have drain plugs. Some do not. For differentials that do not have drain plugs, the cover will need to be removed, or the fluid will need to be evacuated. That little picture on the right there is a fluid evacuator. You hook shop air to it, and it actually creates a vacuum. You hook that little clear hose up and stick it into the fill of the differential, and it sucks it out. It takes a long time, especially because diff fluid is really thick, but it works. So otherwise you're pulling the diff cover off and resealing it just to change the fluid. So totally up to you. Either way, you're accomplishing the same thing. Differentials require gear lube, which is thicker than oil, much thicker than oil. Gear lubes are categorized by weight. 80-90 is the most common weight. It's conventional. Some other weights are 75/90, 75/40. These weights are always going to be synthetic for you, so something to pay attention to. If you're not sure, what to put in your transmission, just go ahead and look at your shop's service information, and it should be pretty easy to look up for you. Okay, now let's talk about tune-ups. Engine tune-ups recommended every 100,000 miles. What is a tune-up? A tune-up consists of the following: replacing spark plugs, setting the spark plug gap, replacing the spark plug wires, sometimes coil boots if it's coil on plug, also replacing the air filter, cleaning the throttle body, and cleaning the mass airflow sensor. Many of the transverse engines, or transverse engine is an engine that's mounted sideways or a front wheel drive vehicle, will require the upper intake plenum to be removed to gain access to the spark plugs if it's a 6-cylinder. If it's a 4-cylinder, they're typically right there. Probably the easiest thing you'll ever do is a 4-cylinder tune-up. But if it's a 6-cylinder, lots of times you got to remove the upper intake to get to the rear 3 spark plugs. Here's a tech tip for you. Whenever you're doing that, it's a good idea to replace the intake gaskets. Sometimes you can technically reuse them, but usually they're pretty cheap, and we just want to be on the safe side. We always just replace them whenever we're removing an intake. Okay, we're moving on to brakes. Brake jobs. Come on, there we go. Very common service and a good money maker. You can get really quick at brakes. You want to be careful when you're doing it because brakes are obviously pretty important, quite a safety issue. So always pay attention to what you're doing, but you guys can get really quick and efficient at doing brake jobs. When replacing brake pads, always clean and lube the brake slides. So the brake slides meaning you have a brake caliper bracket which bolts to the spindle. The brake caliper itself, which houses the piston, needs to be able to slide back and forth. And there's going to be pins that allow that to happen. Always remove those pins, clean off all the dirty grease or whatever that's in there, clean them out good, and lube them. Whatever your shop usually use, I use anti-seize actually to lube them, and I've had great luck with it. So there is, I think they do sell actual brake slide lubricant, but yeah, I've always used anti-seize. So let's see. Oh yeah, new brake pads will come with new clips that can be replaced. The clips sit in the caliper bracket. They allow the brake pad to sit in there snugly and not bounce around or rattle around in there. When replacing brake rotors, you're always going to want to take a clean rag and some brake clean in an aerosol form. Spray them down, wipe them off. That's going to remove the oil off of them. They have shipping oil. They're going to have shipping oil on them when you open them up from the package. If you do not do this, you're going to have brake pads that squeal. So this is a very important thing. Always clean them off before installing the brake rotors. Your next step is going to be compressing the caliper piston. And here's another tech tip for you, but remove the reservoir cap. It's going to make your life a lot easier. It's going to allow those pistons to compress. So think about it. When you're compressing those pistons, you're forcing the brake fluid out of the caliper up through the lines. It's going to actually fill the reservoir. So if you don't have the cap off, it's going to build pressure in that reservoir, make things a lot more difficult. So take the cap off. Go ahead and replace your brake pads, reinstall the caliper. And here's something to remember. Certain rear caliper pistons have to be rotated while compressing. You're going to find that rear brake calipers that integrate the emergency brake, so if they have a actual metal cable going into them with a lever, that's your emergency brake, hand brake. They use that, and the pistons actually rotate. It's kind of like a screw inside there. So rather than just pushing a compressing a piston straight into the caliper, you need to rotate them clockwise and the rears. Rotate the pistons clockwise while compressing it, and there's some tools that we'll talk about later that aid with this, but that's how you do those. Here's a tech tip for you. It is okay to use an impact to remove brakes hardware. So all your brake bolts, go ahead and use an impact to remove them. You can use an impact to install them as well, but always check the tightness by hand. You don't want to chance any loose fasteners when it comes to brakes. So I always get in the habit of, get done with my brake job, I'll grab my 3/8 ratchet, 1/2 inch ratchet, whatever it may be, and double check my fasteners. Make sure they're tight enough, as tight as I want them to be. So we are going to move on to belts. Belt replacement. Belt replacement, serpentine belt, power steering belt, air compressor belt. They're all a maintenance item. Rubber belts, so eventually they're going to have to be replaced. The best way to judge the condition of a belt is to just look at it, visually inspect it. You're going to be looking for cracking, you're going to be looking for fraying. Another thing is if you encounter a noisy belt or a squealing belt and it appears okay, just replace it. Belts can dry up and get noisy. Sometimes belts, for whatever reason, they'll look great, but they're just noisy. Just replace them. You're always going to want to check the belt tension and tensioner when replacing belts. Tension and tensioner when replacing a noisy belt. You want to make sure the belt has proper amount of tension on it, because if it's too loose, that can also cause the noise. Tech tip: always remember to check all the rotating pulleys when the belt is off. So every time you guys have a belt off, there's going to be, put your hand down there, spin all the pulleys. You're going to listen and feel for any faulty ones. Basically, you're going to feel if it feels rough or has a it's kind of a raspy sound when you spin it. You're going to want to take care of that then. So if you spin the idlers, I always grab everything. I always grab the power steering pulley, spin that. I grab the AC compressor, spin that. Just because you got it off, now's the time to do it. You'll be surprised at how many times you find something, and that's when you want to address it. Another tech tip: before slapping the belt on, take your old belt and your new belt and match it up. You want to make sure you're getting the right belt. It really sucks to get the belt wrapped around all the pulleys just to find that it's too short and you can't get the tensioner to release far enough to get the belt on. Another tech tip is when you get your new belt, get in the habit of installing it with the letters facing forward so you can read it. That is the correct way to replace a belt. I'm not 100% sure. That's just how the manufacturers make them. Some belts are rotational, most are not. But just do that. I always look at that and I can tell if a tech's paying attention to what he's doing. Okay, so that's a wrap for Module 2. Go ahead and hit your easy button. That was pretty easy. And Module 3. Module 3, we're going to talk all about engines and understanding engines. So we'll see you next time and go over some great stuff. See ya.